Day number 3.
Crimes Reasonable Parental Control and Correction Amendment Bill, first reading.
Mr Speaker.
I call David Garrett.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Crimes Reasonable Parental Control and Correction Amendment Bill be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce this bill to the House today. There are so many problems with the current legislation, it's difficult to know where to start. It was passed in the dying days of the last government at a time when, after 8 years of suspecting they were out of touch, the people went and established that that was the case beyond all doubt. It is a law that has turned good parents into criminals, Mr Speaker. It is as simple as that. The previous government decided that they were better parents than the people themselves. They forced upon the nation their otherworldly view that those who smack their kids are no different from those who bash, abuse and kill them. And, Mr Speaker, I must sadly add that they were aided and abetted in that regard by the National Party. I couldn't really explain the bill's purpose any better than the preamble does, Mr Speaker, and I won't read it all to save time. The first paragraph reads, "The purpose of this bill is to repeal Section 59 of the Crimes Act 61 and substitute a new section to provide that parents and those in the place of parents no longer commit a criminal offence if they use reasonable force to correct their children's behaviour." And then the preamble goes on to talk about the definition of reasonable force. Mr Speaker, the terrible irony, or one of the many, is that this bill is really no different from the very good amendment that member Chester Borrows, who's in the House, proposed during the debate over the law now in force. The need for that amendment, or for this amendment, Mr Speaker, has only grown stronger. I hear silly comment from someone that the world's moved on. Well, indeed it has, Mr Speaker. Experience has shown us that this bill not only doesn't achieve anything, but it is counterproductive. The Prime Minister and his colleagues were no doubt hoping the recent latter review of the anti-smacking law, as it's become known, would be the end of the matter. Perhaps it might have been, had the report not been a complete and utter whitewash. To this end, a series of case studies were completely distorted by the latter review to back up the wishful claim that the bill is working well. I'll provide just one example for now, Mr Speaker. A father who was discharged, this is from the latter review, a father who was discharged without conviction for shaking his daughter's shoulders suddenly became a man in the latter review who was convicted and then discharged for punching his daughter 3 times in the head and mouth. Completely incorrect on both limbs. Discharged without conviction and convicted and discharged are two very different things. Even more different is shaking by the shoulders compared to punching in the head and mouth. There are plenty other examples that I'm sure my colleague, the Honourable John Boscawen, will touch on later. The bill was originally in John's name, and he has worked tirelessly in public meetings all over the country to assure parents that at least some MPs in this House are not deaf to their concerns. Once upon a time, Mr Speaker, it seemed that the Prime Minister, John Key, was also listening, but sadly no longer. When writing the notes for this speech, it occurred to me that, based on past quotes, I could have asked the Prime Minister to write the entire thing for me. I'll share some with the House, Mr Speaker. Mr Key once described the anti-smacking law, the law that's in place now, as, quote, a complete and utter dog's breakfast, badly drafted and extremely vague, close quote. He also said, and here's the kicker, the Borrows Amendment was the right place to settle, quote unquote. The Borrows Amendment was the right place to settle, but Mr Borrows was browbeaten into voting against his own amendment. Shameful, absolutely shameful, Mr Speaker, that the system does not allow the members over there, and there are many of them and we know it, who would very happily vote for this bill tonight if they weren't under the whip. Mr Speaker, another key quote, linking a light smack with child abuse, said Mr Key is, quote, bloody insulting, close quote. Well, he's right. It's bloody insulting to compare a light smack on the leg with a bash. Oh, I'm quoting the Prime Minister. Yet that was the argument put forward by many proponents of the current law. Mr. Speaker, I will never forget my introduction to politics, if you like, was a meeting in Helensville. In fact, Ms Fenton was there too, which was addressed by Sue Bradford, the former Green member. And after the meeting was over, I took her to one side and had a quiet word, and I said, do you really believe that any swine who thinks it's okay to hit their kid with a piece of wood or a piece of pipe would not do so as a result of this law change? And she said no. I was astounded. Sue Bradford, who was behind it, admitted that this bill, this act in place now, did absolutely nothing to prevent child abuse. What it did do was criminalise good parents. Since the law has been passed, Mr. Speaker, more than 20 children have been murdered. 20 children. This law did nothing for 6-month-old Cesar Taylor. It did nothing to stop the murders of Nia Glassie, Cash McKinnon, or any of the others killed by those who were supposed to protect him. Notifications of possible child abuse received by Child, Youth and Family numbered 125,000 in the past 12 months. 125,000, 57 a day, every day. The anti-smacking law, Mr. Speaker, has done absolutely nothing to change it. In fact, the numbers have gone up. Now that's evidence alone, surely, that not only is the bill ineffective, it's made things worse. Mr. Speaker, something that the hysterical debate, or somewhat hysterical debate at the time, seemed to forget is that beating your child, bashing your child, was already against the law. What made anyone think that the anti-smacking legislation would cause such parents, and I use the word reluctantly, to think twice before inflicting such terrible harm? There are many people who disagree with the idea of a light smack. That's their prerogative. That's their right. When things go awry, Mr. Speaker, is when their views are forced on other equally good parents who choose to give their children a light smack for the purposes of correction. Not a bash, not using a weapon, but a light smack. They're a world apart, as the Prime Minister admitted in speeches made by him when the law currently in force was before this House. Section 5, subsection 2 of this bill clearly defines unreasonable force and thus removes the confusion many parents have about the current law. It also removes an enormous amount of power from the police, power that has often been improperly used. It's pretty straightforward, Mr. Speaker. If the child suffers more than transitory or trifling injury, then it's unreasonable force. If the discipline, and it's not discipline, is, quote, inflicted by any weapon, tool or other implement, close quote, then it's unreasonable force. If it is carried out by any means that is cruel or degrading, it's unreasonable force. That's what lawyers call codifying the law, Mr. Speaker. Such a clause, as Chester Burrows and John Key once recognised, would help prevent the law from criminalising good parents. It also recognises that those few cases that escaped conviction under the old law, such as the use of a riding crop or a piece of wood, were and are unacceptable. This is a bill that should satisfy those who genuinely feel that the old law didn't go far enough, as well as the 87% of New Zealanders who said last year in a properly constituted referendum, not some telephone poll or a write-in survey, that the current law has gone much too far. It won't please those who feel smacking should be banned altogether, but that's okay. It's not for us politicians to tell parents how to raise their children, Mr. Speaker. It's not our job to judge parents for disciplining the children how they see fit, so long as they stay within the confines of reasonable law. If we fail to pass this bill, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we're doing. 122 of us here are saying to the parents of New Zealand, we know better than you. We know better than you. That's the kind of arrogance that got that party kicked out, Mr Speaker, probably for the next